Hello everybody, this is Himdad Abdulqahar Muhammad with you again in another lesson in translation module, translation theory and practice, and this is lesson number 3. In this lesson, our topic would be theories of translation or translation theories, and then sometime we will talk about some approaches that take different directions from each other. At first, we have to define what do we mean by translation theory. It is a science which studies the systemic examination of translation, and according to Peter Newmark, translation theory is a body of information related to translation process and the text together. So previously, source text-oriented translations were very popular, but with the advancement of technology and with the world globalization over time, it has been observed that source text-oriented translations could not create the same effect on the target audiences. For this reason, target text-oriented translations took place, and target audience was expected to have more effect from the translated texts. So, in conclusion, we say that the goal is not translating the words, but being able to convey the main idea of the text in the source language to the target language recipients. We understand that there are different theories and different approaches according with the passage of time. There has been some changes or shifts of focus. In this lesson, we are going to take some of the most famous approaches to translation. The first approach is called Levy's approach. Levy is a Czech translation theoretician, Jerry Levy, and a scientist who has influenced the translation researchers with his approach. According to Levy's approach, the translation process differs from the other translation theories because Levy takes the translation process and the form of the translated text into consideration, and he considers translation of a written text as a branch of art. In fact, he believes that it is of high importance to assign the communicative aspects of significant formal properties of the foreign writer when we are doing translation, and he believes that literary works should not lose its literary value, so everything should be taken into consideration. Levy also argues that artistic aspects of a work can be determined by logic, and that those aspects cannot be transferred with the same artistic value if the translator is not well qualified. So they should be transferred with the same artistic value to the target language, free from its content, its world, and the language, and by replacing them with formal components of another language. So here the translator plays a great role, whether he is qualified or not, because according to Levy, literary works should not lose their literary values. According to this approach also, the goal of translation is to stay with the original text message and to comprehend and to transfer it to the original message to the target audience or to the target recipients. According to Levy, translation is more of a recreating process. It should be consistent and holistic, and the goal of translation should be recreating the effect of the source text in another language. So Levy here adopts what is called faithful translation method. And according to this approach also, the artistic and the aesthetic values of the original text during translation process must be kept and maintained. There are two phases of translating, or the process of translation. One of them is called comprehending phase, and the other is called transmitting the comprehended message. The message that's comprehended, you try to transmit that to another language. Another approach, on the other hand, Koller's approach. Koller has produced plentiful works of translation and analyzed different dimensions of translation and brings forward a very important issue in translation, which is called the equivalence issue. According to Kohler, phonological, morphological, syntactic units need to be transferred to the target language with a linguistic interpretation during translation. So the first thing the translator must do is he should internalize the original text in both structural and semantic terms, and then will find the equivalent patterns to be able to transfer the original text to the target language text. And according to Kohler, translation is an activity, or translation activity is an equivalence operation between the source text and the text in the target language. And Kohler divides equivalence into two types: formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. In formal equivalence, equivalence in the source language text is dealt with in terms of content and form. While on the other hand, in dynamic equivalence, the goal is to produce a natural text in the target language and to make it comprehensible, avoiding any misunderstandings. In dynamic equivalence also, the focus is on the message and the receptor of the message. And here in this approach, the translator must determine primarily to whom the original text is addressed, and he should translate accordingly, according to the culture of that special group, because each social group or each special group have their own diction, have their own register, have their own needs and demands. Transferring the source text to the target language by keeping the equivalence depends on analyzing the style of the foreign writer, of the original writer. And what do you mean by style? Style, in short, means usage of a language in a certain context by a certain writer for a certain purpose. So it is the translator who picks up and uses language items with his own criteria in order to transmit the thoughts of the source language user and add a certain specialty in his words when he is trying to change it into the target language. The third approach that we are going to talk about is called Kleopfer's approach. First of all, the general idea of prioritizing formal properties of a text, that the message in the original text may not be transferred to the target language in the same fashion, has led to the source text-based translations during this period of time. But later on, it has been understood that it is not sufficient to deal with translation at only equivalence level. Because while the translator is reproducing a linguistic work in the target language, he should do his best in order to make the original text be comprehensible in the target language. So the translator's task here is to reflect the language and culture of the source text in the target text. Based on this, Kleopfer's definition of translation is as follows. Translation is a creative writing, but not rewriting in a random fashion. It is the writership of the writer. That's in short how he defines translation. So Kleopfer agrees with the translation produced in accordance with the type of the text and the emphasis on the transfer of form and content. So to Kleopfer, as a summary, translation is the photocopy of an original text. So translators need to reflect all the beauty of the original text in the translated text as they are. And he focuses on this fact that words or word groups should reflect the implicit expressions. And in case we have problems or we face difficulties due to cultural differences, Kleopfer suggests that interpretation takes place during translation. Appel's approach, or Appel's theory of translation, focuses on the transfer of implicit expressions of words or word groups, and he believes that all the properties of the source text should be primarily analyzed when translating literary texts. He says that there are two dimensions of translation process according to Appel's approach. The first is understanding a text. This is the first dimension, and the second dimension is the production process. So when you are doing translation in the production process, the content, the style and meanings of the indicators are all needed to be taken into consideration and to be transferred from the source language to the target language. And the final approach that we are going to talk about in this lesson is a very famous, known by Scopus theory, but we refer to them by the name of the people who have promoted it or who have invented that approach. Ries and Vermeer's approach. Ries and Vermeer's approach covers the effect of the produced literary text on the reader. That's why they call Scopus theory. The word scopus or scopos derived from Greek, and it means target or goal. And scopus as the term was first used by Hans J. Vermeer in 1978. Scopus theory is mainly based on literary theories, which reflects a general shift to communication theory, to text linguistics, and text theory and reception theories. According to this theory, the translation must be focused on the function aimed at the target text in its own cultural setting. And when these theories were moved away from linguistic translation theories, Vermeer proposed a functional approach to translation. By functional approach, what's the purpose of translation, the target text, reader, and contingencies. And instead of a structural approach, he proposed that structural approach focuses on language and text only. So according to this theory, every translation is an action, and every action has an aim or a purpose. Likewise, every translation has an aim. So the translator is an actor who takes into consideration, or who must take into consideration, the cultural aspects that are contributing factors in the source text and different aspects of the target culture during translation process, and who produces a new text on the related cultural platform. The translator has more freedom in this approach because, depending on the source text, it was replaced by depending on the purpose or the aim. So we can conclude that Scopus theory has a functional quality. In a translation, according to Scopus theory, a new text should be produced in such a way that it should create the same effect in the target language. If we try to define translation according to this theory or to this approach, we can say that translation is not primarily producing an exact equivalent of the source text, but to produce a new text in accordance with a certain aim or a certain purpose. According to this approach, translation depends on the reaction of a translator to a source text. So the translator is free to choose scopus, that's to say aim or purpose needed for a source text to be comprehended by the aimed recipients and responsible for his task. According to Vermeer, translation is transcoding words and sentence patterns in a text into equivalent words or sentence patterns in another language. So he believes that the act of translation cannot be dissociated from the aim of the text produced through translation. So he goes on to say that an act of translation could also be called as a constant intercultural transfer. So scopus in its general meaning is translation for a certain purpose. And Weimer divides his concept into three: a translation intention or translator's intention, and the aim of the original text, and the function of the translation. According to this theory, the translator is the center. The translator holds all the responsibility. At the same time, the translator himself decides whether the translation is good or bad. And finally, there are two important things about this approach or this theory, Scopus theory. There are some other writers who followed up or who built their theories based on this approach. For example, Torrey is a more product-oriented view or more product-oriented theory than Weimer, who is more process-oriented theory. So they are different in this aspect. Later on in the coming lessons, we are going to talk about product or process translation, these two. Finally, we can say Scopus theory takes translation act as a meaningful process, which means what the aim of translation product is and what could it give to the reader. Thank you very much for your listening, and thanks for your attention.